The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $70, and Delbert Hoyt laughed loud enough that the folding chairs in the back row rattled. It was the kind of laugh a man throws when he wants the whole room to know he is not the fool in the transaction. He slapped his thigh, the flat of his palm hitting the pressed crease of his tan slacks, and turned to the man beside him with a grin wide as a split melon. $70, he said, for a piece of a wall. $70 for bricks and mortar, and whatever dead mouse was fossilized inside it. He said it twice, because Delbert Hoyt was the sort of man who believed a joke gained value with repetition, the way he believed everything gained value if you shouted about it long enough. The object in question sat on a flatbed trailer at the far edge of the yard, and it was not, by any honest measure, a handsome thing. It was a section of interior wall, roughly 4 feet by 5, cut out of an old building down on Merchant Street the previous spring when the demolition crew had taken the Hollis hardware block down to make room for a bank branch that never got built. The wall had been sawn free with the safe still bricked into it, because the safe, an old Mosler with a scarred iron face, had been mortared in on 3 sides, and no one on the crew had the time or the inclination to pry it out proper. So they'd cut around it and set the whole heavy slab of brick and plaster and steel out into the yard, where it had sat for 18 months, collecting rain and pigeon droppings and the mild disinterest of every man who walked past it. The dial on the safe was frozen. The handle was seized. Somebody had, at some point, taken a cold chisel to the seam of the door and given up after making an ugly gouge that told everyone who came, after that the effort was not worth the outcome. It was the 6th of November, 1978, at the old Hollis estate auction outside Coldwater, Missouri, and there were maybe 80 people standing on the wet grass that morning. The auctioneer was a Baptist named Rennie Fitch, who ran his cadence like a hymn, and when he'd come to the wall section, he had almost skipped it, because a man had to be either very foolish or very hopeful to bid on a piece of building. He'd started at 20. He'd gone to 50. And then a lean, stooped figure in a canvas jacket and a soft, sweat-marked work cap had lifted one finger from the top of a fence post, and Rennie had said 70, going once, going twice, and the gavel had come down and Delbert Hoyt had begun to laugh. The man who bought it was named Harlon Poe. He was 68 years old that autumn, and he had been a locksmith in Coldwater since he came home from Korea in 1953. His hands, when he lifted that one finger, looked like they had been made from the same material as the safe itself. All seams and hammered ridges and small, pale scars where springs and pin tumblers and drill bits had taught him the shape of his work over 5 decades. He wore a chambray shirt, washed so many times the blue had gone almost to bone. He wore a canvas jacket the color of dry mud. His face was long and lined the way certain river bluffs are lined, and his eyes were pale and set deep, and did not move when Delbert Hoyt laughed at him. He simply nodded at Rennie Fitch, took his little paper ticket from the clerk's table, folded it once, and put it in his shirt pocket next to a stub of yellow pencil. Delbert Hoyt was 49 years old, and heavy through the middle and clean-shaven in the way of men who shave twice a day because their beards embarrass them. He owned a used car lot on the highway out toward Poplar Bluff, 3 acres of pennants and a plywood office with a window unit that leaked. He wore a sport coat the color of a traffic cone that morning, and a heavy gold ring on the smallest finger of his right hand, and he had driven up to the auction in a champagne-colored Lincoln that he parked crosswise across 2 spaces, because he did not, on principle, believe in lines drawn by other people. He had come for the tractors. He'd bought a Ford 8N for $1,100, and he considered that a piece of business worth celebrating, and he was celebrating it now by making sure everyone within 30 yards understood that Harlon Poe had paid $70 for a wall. Tin Man, he called it, that first time. He said, "Well, look at old Harlon there. He's gone and bought himself a Tin Man in a brick coat." He said it to the man beside him, and the man beside him laughed a small, obliging laugh, and Delbert took that laugh as fuel, and turned and said it to a wider circle. Tin Man in a brick coat, $70, and it don't even talk back. He said Harlon was going to take that thing home and put a lamp on it. He said Harlon was going to have his supper off it. He said a lot of things, and Harlon Poe did not answer, and did not turn, and did not seem to hear, though he heard every word. What Delbert did not know, and what none of the 80 people standing on that wet grass knew, was that Harlon Poe had walked slowly around that wall section 3 times before the bidding began. He had looked at the hinges. He had looked at the model number stamped faint into the lower right corner of the door. He had put his palm flat against the face of the safe and held it there a long moment, as if he were listening for a pulse. And he had noticed, because noticing was the trade he had been apprenticed into as a boy, that the bricks around the safe were not the same bricks as the rest of the wall. They were a shade darker. They were bedded in a mortar that had a slightly different color and a slightly finer grain. Somebody had put that safe into that wall after the wall was already there. Somebody had gone to considerable trouble to hide a safe that any hardware store in America would have been happy to display in the middle of a floor. And in Harlon Poe's long experience, men did not hide safes for the pleasure of hiding them. They hid safes because there was something inside worth the hiding. Harlon Poe had been apprenticed at the age of 14 to a locksmith named August Reinhardt, a German who had come to Missouri in 1912 and who kept a shop on Elm Street with a bell over the door and a canary in a brass cage. August Reinhardt had a saying he offered his apprentices the way other men offered candy. A lock, he said, is a question the maker asks, and the locksmith is the man patient enough to give the right answer. He said it in his soft, careful English, and he said it whenever a boy grew frustrated at a stubborn wafer or a bent pick. And Harlon Poe had heard it so many times that by the age of 17, he could hear August Reinhardt saying it in his sleep. He heard it now, standing at the edge of the wet grass while Delbert Hoyt made his jokes. A question the maker asks. And Harlon Poe intended, as he had always intended, to give the right answer. He drove the wall home on a borrowed flatbed, with a young man named Curtis Vane riding in the passenger seat. Curtis was 19 and quiet, and had been working at Harlan's shop after school, and on Saturdays for 3 years, and he had the kind of stillness in him that Harlan recognized from his own boyhood. Curtis did not ask why they had bought a wall. He watched the road, and when they came to the long, slow grade up out of the river bottom, he reached down and shifted the truck without being asked, because he had learned already that Harlan's clutch leg was not what it used to be. When they turned into the gravel yard behind Harlan's shop, Delbert Hoyt happened to be driving past on the highway in his champagne Lincoln, and he laid on the horn and hollered something out the window that neither man in the flatbed troubled to catch. Curtis looked over. Harlan did not. There's a kind of patience that looks like weakness, right up until the moment it doesn't. And Harlon Poe had been carrying that kind of patience so long, it fit him like the canvas jacket on his shoulders. They unloaded the wall with a chain hoist and set it upright on 2 heavy oak timbers in the back of the shop, and by supper time the whole town knew about it. Coldwater in 1978 was a town of about 2,000 people, and news of that kind moved through it the way heat moves through a cast-iron skillet, slow and even and thorough. By the next morning, the men at the counter of the Dixie Diner were calling it the Tin Man, because Delbert Hoyt's nickname had traveled faster than the wall itself. By the afternoon, the checker at the IGA was asking Harlan's wife, Mavis, whether it was true he'd paid $100 for a piece of a building, and Mavis, who had been married to Harlon Poe for 41 years, and had long ago made peace with what other people thought of him, smiled and said it was 70, and it was none of their business, and would she please ring up the coffee. An old friend of Harlan's, a man named Ellis Trundle, who ran the feed store and who had been at the auction and had not laughed, but had also not understood, came by the shop on the 3rd day and stood inside the doorway with his hat in his hands. He looked at the wall. He looked at Harlan, who was seated on a low stool with a work light aimed at the dial. He said, "Harlan, is this thing going to open?" And Harlan said, "Without looking up, it'll open." And Ellis said, "And what if there's nothing in it?" And Harlan said, "Then I'll have learned something." And Ellis nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he doesn't agree, but has known the other man long enough to know that argument would be a form of trespassing, and he put his hat back on and went home. The safe had been made in Hamilton, Ohio, sometime around 1908, and the man who had first owned it was named Josiah Hollis. Josiah Hollis had opened the hardware store on Merchant Street in 1911 and had run it honestly for 34 years, until an evening in the spring of 1945, when he had been found dead behind his own counter with the till drawer open and the day's receipts gone. The county sheriff at the time, a man named Frank Coy, had ruled it a robbery gone wrong and had put the blame, over the following weeks, on a young black veteran named Elias Weathers, who had returned from the war 3 months earlier and who had, on the afternoon in question, been seen walking past the hardware store carrying a canvas duffel. Elias Weathers had denied it. He had said he was walking home from the bus depot. He had said the duffel contained his uniform and a Bible and a photograph of his mother. But the town of Coldwater in the spring of 1945 was not a town inclined to hear a young black man's denial over a white sheriff's certainty, and Elias Weathers had been tried in the county courthouse in the month of June and sentenced to 25 years at the state penitentiary in Jefferson City, where he had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1951 without ever seeing the outside of a cell again. That was the story of the safe, though nobody standing on the wet grass at the Hollis estate auction had thought about Elias Weathers in a long time. Josiah Hollis had no direct children, and the store had passed to a nephew who ran it into the ground by 1962, and the building had sat empty for 16 years before the demolition crew came for it. What none of them knew, and what only Josiah Hollis had known on the night he died, was that he had spent the last 2 weeks of his life bricking a small Mosler safe into the back wall of his own store, behind a shelf of galvanized buckets, because he had come to understand something about his own bookkeeper and his own account at the Coldwater Farmers Bank that he had not yet decided how to make public. The bookkeeper's name was Merritt Coy. He was the sheriff's younger brother, and Josiah Hollis, an honest man in a town where honesty was a private matter, had been building his case in silence, the way a careful man builds anything worth building, one brick at a time. Harlon Poe worked on the safe for 11 nights. He did not force it. He did not take a torch to it, though he had a torch. He did not drill the door, though he had drills fine enough to have done it in an hour. He worked instead the way August Reinhardt had taught him to work, which was to treat the lock as a conversation, and himself as the more patient speaker. He cleaned the dial with a soft brush and a light oil. He warmed the door plate with a lamp to draw out the moisture that 33 years of Missouri weather had driven into the works. He listened, with a stethoscope pressed against the steel, to the small dry clicks of wheels that had not turned since Harry Truman was president. Curtis Vane sat across from him most of those evenings, not speaking, learning by watching, the way Harlan himself had learned. On the 7th night, Harlan felt the first wheel drop into place. On the 9th, the second. On the 11th, at a little past 10 in the evening, with the shop quiet and the November wind pressing at the tin roof, the third wheel dropped, and the whole mechanism gave a soft, small sound, like a sound a man might make in his sleep when a bad dream lets him go, and the handle, when Harlan lifted his hand to it, turned without resistance. He did not open the door right away. He sat back on his stool and looked at the safe for a long moment. Curtis looked at him. Harlan reached up and took off his work cap and set it on his knee, and then, only then, did he pull the handle down the rest of the way and swing the door free on its old brass hinges. Inside, on a shelf of green, felt gone brittle with age, were 3 things. There was a leather ledger, brown and cracked, with the initials J.H. tooled into the cover. There was a canvas bank sack tied with waxed string, heavy in a way that made Curtis's eyebrows lift when Harlan set it on the workbench. And there was an envelope, sealed with wax, addressed in a careful copperplate hand to whoever should open this safe. Harlan opened the envelope first. He did not open the sack. He did not open the ledger. He held the letter under the work light and he read it slowly, once through in silence, and then again aloud, for Curtis, in a voice that grew steadier as it went. The letter was dated the 14th of April, 1945, 5 days before Josiah Hollis died. It said, in careful sentences, that Merritt Coy had been drawing from the store's account at the Coldwater Farmers Bank for 2 years and 8 months, in sums small enough to escape a casual eye and large enough, in total, to have bought a house. It said that Josiah Hollis had confronted Merritt Coy on the 10th of April and had told him he had 1 week to make it right, or he would take the ledgers to the state bank examiner in Jefferson City. It said that Josiah Hollis feared, though he did not wish to seem dramatic, that this decision might cost him his life. It said that the ledger inside the safe contained every entry, in Merritt Coy's own hand, with dates and amounts and the corresponding withdrawals verified against bank statements Josiah had obtained by his own patient effort. It said that the sack contained $640 in cash, which was Josiah's private savings, and which he wished to be given, in the event of his death, to his housekeeper, a woman named Ada Weathers, who had 2 grown sons and whose kindness had sustained him through the long years since his wife had passed. It said at the end, in a hand that had begun to tremble, "Please tell the truth about me if you can. Please tell the truth about whoever else this touches. A man's name is the only thing that outlasts him, and mine has been in my keeping long enough that I would like it kept honest." Curtis Vane, at 19, had not cried in front of another man since he was 11 years old. He did not cry now, but he sat very still, and Harlon Poe, who understood stillness the way other men understood speech, let him have it. Then Harlon folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in its envelope, and he sat for a long time with his hand on the ledger. He could have kept it. The cash in the sack, adjusted for the years, was not a small sum, and there was no living Josiah Hollis to miss it, and Ada Weathers had been in the ground since 1969. Her sons, if any survived, had scattered long ago. No one in Coldwater in the fall of 1978 was waiting for a letter from a dead hardware man. No one would ever have known. Harlon Poe sat with his hand on the ledger, and he thought about that, honestly, because a man who does not admit to himself the shape of a temptation is a man who has already lost to it. And then he closed the safe door, gently, out of habit, and he stood up, and he said to Curtis, "We've got work to do in the morning." In the morning, he drove to Poplar Bluff, and he walked into the county sheriff's office, which was no longer run by any Coy, and he asked to speak to whoever handled old cases. He was directed to a young deputy named Ramona Suggs, who was patient and courteous, and who listened for 40 minutes while Harlon laid the letter and the ledger on her desk, and explained, in his slow way, what they were. She asked him 3 careful questions. She made 2 telephone calls, and then she asked him, very quietly, if he would be willing to speak to a woman named Delphia Weathers, who was Elias Weathers' daughter, and who was, at that moment, a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher living in a small brick house in Cape Girardeau. Harlon Poe drove to Cape Girardeau the following Saturday. He wore his good jacket, which was a canvas jacket only slightly newer than the one he wore to the shop, and he took Mavis with him, because Mavis had said, on hearing the story, that a woman meeting news like that ought to have another woman in the room. Delphia Weathers opened the door herself. She was a tall woman with silver hair pinned at the nape of her neck and a dignity in her carriage that had not been given to her by any easy life. She led them into a parlor with lace at the windows, and she made them coffee, and Harlon Poe, who had rehearsed nothing, told her the truth in the plainest words he had. He gave her the letter. He gave her a photocopy of the ledger, because the sheriff's office had kept the original. He told her about the safe and the wall and the auction, and Josiah Hollis's careful copperplate hand. Delphia Weathers read the letter twice. She did not cry until the second reading, and then she cried the way certain rivers rise, slowly and without noise, and past every bank that had ever contained them. And then she folded the letter and put it in her lap, and she looked at Harlon Poe, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Poe. My father died in a cell, believing no one would ever know his name was Clean." Harlon said, "Ma'am, his name is Clean. It has been clean the whole time." And Delphia Weathers nodded, and Mavis, who was seated beside her, took her hand. The money in the sack, which came to $640, and which the state, after some brief legal fuss, released to the estate of Ada Weathers' descendants, Harlon Poe never touched. He drove home from Cape Girardeau, and he parked the truck behind the shop, and he went inside and he made a cup of coffee. And when Curtis Vane came in the next morning, Harlon handed him a broom and said, "The floor wants sweeping." The story of the safe and the letter reached Coldwater by the first week of December, because Delphia Weathers had contacted the newspaper in Cape Girardeau, and the newspaper in Cape Girardeau had contacted the newspaper in Coldwater. And by Christmas, the Tin Man in the brick coat was on the front page under the headline that read, "33 years late, hardware man's word is kept." Merritt Coy had died in 1961, and Frank Coy in 1968, and neither one of them was available to answer for what had been done. But the record was set straight in the county courthouse, and a formal exoneration for Elias Weathers was signed by a judge on the 14th of February, 1979, and Delphia Weathers came up from Cape Girardeau to receive the paper in person, and she wore her father's old army pin on her lapel. Delbert Hoyt did not come to the courthouse that day. He had, in fact, been noticeably quiet since the story broke. He said very little at the diner, and less at the feed store and the champagne. Lincoln began to appear less often on the highway, and by the following spring the used car lot on the way to Poplar Bluff had a for sale sign at the entrance, and by the fall of 1980, Delbert Hoyt had moved to Florida, where, according to what little report ever came back, he had gone into the business of selling boats to men who wanted to be told they had made a shrewd purchase. The safe itself was donated, at Delphia Weathers' request, to the County Historical Society, which set it up in the small museum on the courthouse square, with a plaque that told the story in 8 careful sentences. The plaque named Josiah Hollis, and Elias Weathers, and Ada Weathers, and Delphia Weathers. It did not name Harlon Poe at his request. It said only that the safe had been recovered and opened by a local craftsman. Harlon Poe walked over to the museum one evening in the following June, alone, after supper. He stood outside on the sidewalk and he looked in through the plate glass window at the safe on its wooden pedestal, with the door standing open the way he had left it, and the green felt shelf empty, and the small brass plaque catching the last of the daylight. He stood there maybe 2 minutes. He did not go inside. Then he turned around and walked back down Merchant Street toward home, past the empty lot where the hardware store had once stood, with his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket and his cap pulled low against the evening wind. So I'll leave it with you. If you had been Harlon Poe, sitting alone in your shop at 10 o'clock on a November night with a letter no one was waiting for and a sack of cash no living person would miss, would you have closed the door and driven to Poplar Bluff in the morning? Or would you have kept it and told yourself, the way a man can always tell himself, that no one would ever have known?